So, big welcome to everyone. Welcome back as we continue to look at Genesis 12 and some of the major themes and ideas in Genesis 12. Let's begin by reading through verses 1 to 4 and noting some of the main ideas here. Genesis 12 begins with God speaking to Abraham. And so, one of the first main points I note is that God can reveal himself and his truths to you. Many people in other religions believe God speaks through dreams or God speaks in various ways. Some believe through the natural world. But we believe that God can speak directly into your own life. And certainly in the New Testament, this is what Jesus teaches and the Apostle Paul teaches. And if you talk to other Christians and in your own life experience, we know that God can speak into our lives. In chapter 12, God spoke to Abraham and said, "Leave, go from your country and from your father's household and to the land I will show you to." And we know that in the life journey, there are ways in which we need to leave aspects of childhood and child school and move on into what God calls us to. And so there's lots of stages in life where we must move on. There can also be challenges that we face in life where God challenges us to move on beyond childish ways into more adult, responsible, caring, life-giving ways. And the Apostle Paul writes about this in the New Testament. In verse 2, God promises to make a great nation out of Abraham and to bless. And we see this as a continuation of what we read about in chapter 1, where God makes the world good, gives animals and plants life, and he seeks them to flourish and do well. And he makes the first people and says to them that they are to be blessed and be a blessing. And here Abraham is called to be blessed and to be a blessing. That is, God seeks to bless Abraham as he does you and I. And he also seeks to make something out of who we are and out of our lives. So I believe this is a promise that can apply more widely to all of us. Certainly, it was a message that applied to one person, Abraham, and to one nation, Israel. But we believe as Christians that it applies more widely, and that the fullness of the promise, where it says, all the people of the earth will be blessed through you, comes about most fully through Jesus. And that in Jesus, a descendant of Abraham, as the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians 3, the blessing comes to all people of all the earth. And so it'll be worth noting that in Galatians 3, we see the theme of all people being blessed through Jesus. And we could look at that more fully as we go forward. And so keep in mind Galatians 3 and all people being blessed through Jesus, as the Apostle Paul writes there in Galatians 3. There can be conditions on this blessing. That is, the blessing comes as people are obedient and listen to God, and we saw that in Genesis 3. And you can lose the blessing if you do not listen to God. And there are times in all our life's journey where there is a danger, but there is also the message of hope and restoration that comes as well. And in Abraham's life journey, as we read on from chapter 12 through to 50, we'll see there's times where his journey is challenged, and particularly in Genesis 22, Abraham is challenged to sacrifice his son, and if he does, then couldn't it all be lost? And he trusts God, who provides a sacrifice in his place, and the place of Isaac. And so in that sacrifice, the son is saved and the blessing continues. And so there can be testing and challenges in our life journey as well. And then in verse 4, Abraham listens to God, obeys, walks in the ways of God as Noah did, and then we see the blessing then pass on as Abraham moves forward and his offspring are given the land, and the blessing passes on and moves forward. Let's take a few moments now to look at what scholars have said about Genesis 12 and its themes. We could go to Google Scholar and we could look at various scholarly insights into the Abraham narratives as they continue forward. And so I would encourage you, if you've got time, to go to Google Scholar and to do a bit of a search on other resources that you could find there. Using Google Scholar to locate these resources and then taking the opportunity to explore those resources further. That could be very useful and helpful for you. So if we were to put in say Sonic's The Abraham Narratives, we could explore some of the insights that Sonic has identified. He's done a literature review there. If you click on Cite, C-I-T-E, it will give you that resource. Control C, you could copy that, carry it over, Control P, you could paste that into your resource, and you could use that there. If we go to Sonic's resource here. So let's open it up and have a look at what Sonic says about the Abraham narratives. We can see that he goes through some of the different scholars' views, and we could chase those up. He lists different scholars who've looked at the Abraham story or narrative and some of the meanings and ideas that are there. We could learn a lot from them. You could download that resource as well. You could keep a copy of the link of the resource, which you could use later. The Abraham narratives of chapter 12 to 15 are certainly of considerable interest to Christians. The Apostle Paul engages with it, Jesus engages with it, so there is much that has been said. He begins by saying, from Philo and Plato, one of the highest callings of a wise person is to leave the cave where we're in darkness and to step out and to see the bigger world that God is leading us into. And I think that's a valuable and great quote, that God is calling you and I out of a smaller world into a bigger world. And in order to step into the bigger world that God has for us, we need to leave some things behind. And so I think that's a great point, to leave the smaller world, which could be the world of childhood, and then to move and enter into the bigger world that God has for us. Then we need to leave some things behind in order to enter into that bigger world that God has for us. And so that's part of the challenge that I think Genesis 12 is presenting is, will the reader, you and I today, listen to that call to leave behind that which is limiting and holding us back? Just like Moses calls the people out of Egypt to the promised land, and Jesus calls the people to repent and turn, so we too are called to leave behind some things and move towards that which God calls us to. So a healthy, beneficial interpretation would say that God is calling you and I and Abraham to grow, to move, to journey. And this journey can symbolize an external stepping from one place to another, and also an internal change that takes place within. It can be an external leaving behind some things of the past and stepping into new opportunities, but it can also be an internal leaving behind constraints and ways of thinking within and embracing the new that God has for us, where we can grow as people and grow spiritually. Martin Luther found that when he was challenged to leave the Catholic Church, and he said he didn't want to leave the Catholic Church, but I think they threw him out of it. And he then stepped into the new experience that God has for him, which we know as the Protestant Reformation. And within the Catholic Church, there were reformers who stepped out of the way things were done and stepped into the new that God was calling them to. And so we could read about reformers like Luther or reformers within the Catholic Church who had to leave something behind in order to move into the more that God had for them. And you might want to read more about Luther and other reformers who felt the call of God leading them to leave and to move towards more that God has for them. I'm reminded of Francis of Assisi in the Catholic Church, who felt he was called to leave behind certain way things were done and to enter into the Franciscan way that he felt God was calling Francis of Assisi into. Notice the theme that we'll see again in Moses, that sometimes staying where you are can lead you captive physically to certain ways things are done, mentally and spiritually, and we need to break free from these unhealthy attachments in order to grow into all that God has led us to. Sometimes there can be unhealthy social pressures or limiting traditions that can hold a person back. And there can be a need to trust in God as he leads us from where we are towards the place that he is calling to. And we see the need for faith, the need for listening, the need for wisdom. At times there can be the need to have others who would guide, and Abraham had otherwise people to guide him. Moses also had otherwise people, such as his father-in-law, who spoke into Moses' life. So there can be wisdom that's spoken into our lives as we journey, trusting God as he leads us forward. And then there's also, I think at times we need to warn against wrong or incorrect interpretations. If a pastoral leader was to take this and say, you've got to come where I am and do things just as I am, that may not be so healthy an interpretation. When some have used this passage to say we could take land from others, and so in North America, some have gone over and taken land from the native Indian people. In Nepal, some may have taken land and used passages such as this to justify colonialism, where you take land from one another. And that's not what is being referred to here. I'm reminded that Jesus says that he moves away from a home, but foxes have holes and birds have nests, but Jesus says he doesn't have a land. Rather, he opens up the church or the ecclesia as a place that moves to all lands around all the world. And so I see Jesus providing an interesting example of Jesus moving from one land, such as Israel, to many lands, and one place to many places, and being a missionary on a mission, in which Jesus speaks about the ways in which foxes have holes, and the ways in which birds have nests. But he says he doesn't have a place because he's called on a journey and a pilgrimage towards that which God is calling him to. We need to be careful that the idea of a promised land can lead to oppression. So if a leader rises up and says, you have left behind, now give me all your money, give me all your possessions, then that's not good leadership. Tilak and I will talk about starting the Church of Sam and Tilak later. That wouldn't be good, would it? And so yeah, we shouldn't use this idea of call to justify oppression or conquest. Rather, it needs to be understood as a journey towards ethics and to goodness and love and generosity and peace and kindness and flourishing. And so there is a danger if people misuse this call of Abraham as a way of dominating people. And then we can also use the idea of leaving behind in the wrong context. That is, we could abandon a relationship that we're called to commit to. And I know I'm always cautious about leaving a job behind or leaving a place behind or leaving church behind, in that I seek to honour them and keep honouring them and in contact with them. And I think Abraham and Moses in some way honoured where they were from, but at the same time, they journeyed towards a healthy opportunity that opened up for them. Certainly, one of the major themes is faith. That is, we trust in God who is good and is intending good for us. Now, you need faith because on the journey, things don't always go as you would expect. And so as we read Genesis chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, you'll see that things can at times be difficult. If you've ever went on a run, it's easy to start out running and things look good for the first 5 minutes, but after half an hour or an hour, it doesn't look so easy. And so some of my family go on long hikes that go on for many hours or many days. And halfway through is the way journey that's hard. And so we will face challenges. And these challenges can either grow us or cause us to go backwards. When we read Exodus and Moses, they were called to go forward to the promised land, but many of them wanted to go back. So scholars notice that there are many themes that we can see here, including faith, calling, and transformation and change that takes place, and the need to avoid domination or conquest as ways of interpreting. Alan Rost says that Genesis 12 is a pivotal chapter in which God causes Abraham out of a more pagan environment with wrong thinking and wrong theology towards the good purposes that he has for them. The theology of work is a project that says this call to know a healthy work life compares the Tower of Babel, where a narrow group of people build a workplace just for themselves, which is like Egypt, building a pyramid, turning people into slaves. God calls us to be flourishing, to doing well, and a workplace or a place where you're at should be a place where people can flourish and do well. Gerald Bites, in his reflections, portrays Abraham departing as an act of faith, where you might want to depart and leave some things that are not so good for you, and then you need to, on the journey, continually seek God's guidance and allow God to transform you and change you on the journey as you go. David Guzik, in his commentary, highlights recognizing the promises of God, the words of God that are able to encourage you on the journey. And you may include songs and prayers. You may journal and pray as you travel. The promise that God will make you and the work that you do great and valuable. And so it's worth being encouraged, as David Guzik says, by the passages from Genesis 12 through. Stephen Sizer says that this notion of call recognises that in your life and mine and the people that you're leading, there can be a sense of call and purpose. And I remember I was talking to one student and they sensed God calling them to go as a missionary to Cambodia. And then when they spoke to others, they weren't so sure. But when they went over to Cambodia and visited, someone said, could you teach English over there? And they're still there many years later, and they've been part of a school that's been set up to teach English. And through the teaching of English, they teach the gospel, and many are being touched. And some people said, you're a quiet, shy person, but here they are leading a work there. So there's a sense of call that can come to people's lives. So faith enables us to respond to call and to God's will for our lives. Richard Middleton reframes Abraham's call as mission. That is, each one of us have mission and purpose that God calls us to. And this mission includes at times a sense of people needing to be free from sin or whatever holds them back to be redeemed and to move into fullness of life. And he reminds us that we find that in the gospel message and in Jesus, who brings redemption and transformation and salvation and life to us. David Bartlett and Barbara Brown Taylor say that Abraham's call is a journey that'll transform us and the people that we travel with, in which it brings us to embrace the promises that God has for us. And Walter Brueggemann, that I think is a really excellent resource that you might want to look for more on, and he's written a book on Genesis, talks about the pivotal moment of trust. That is, who and what do we trust in? Not trusting in ourselves like the Tower of Babel, but trusting in God, who's got a better purpose for you. Who and what do you obey? Not obeying like Genesis 3, the serpent, but obeying God, who calls you into the better world. And this can bring transformation of us and the people around us. So the departure from a past land to move forward reminds us that as we grow, we do move beyond our parents doing everything for us to where we take greater responsibility for our life and our choices and our work as we grow older. In the woman's Torah commentary, Michelle Shekel says that names and identity can be important, and God could give you a sense of having a new name and a purpose, as Abraham's name is changed to Abraham. In Mary Mill's book, The Story of Abraham and Models of Human Identity, we're reminded that Abraham and his identity were changed as he journeyed towards the better promised land that God had for him. So not only was the promised land changed, but he was changed as well on the journey. There's a sense in which psychologically and sociologically there is change that takes place in our lives as we journey forward. And a number of scholars have written on that. And the pilgrimage resource that I noted before is able to guide us that way. So I encourage you to think about the ways in which God is calling you to journey forward. Can I ask you now to take 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to read through Genesis 12, verses 1 through to 4, and to think about how does that speak into your life and what is a healthy interpretation for you? How does Genesis 12, 1 to 4, speak to you and your life? And you could go on and think, what is a healthy interpretation? What is a dangerous, non-healthy interpretation? And I guess just leave everything behind and go forward could be a non-healthy interpretation. So let's take a few minutes now to read through Genesis 12, 1 to 4, and think about the ways in which this speaks into your life and to mine. And then we'll come back and talk about that a bit in 5 minutes or so. And if you want to share, then speak up and let me know. I'll ask Tillik and Sudesh and Saman and some others to speak. But if you want to speak as well, you let me know. I want to speak, and I'll give you opportunity to speak as well. Yeah. So let's start to gather back again, and we'll ask Tilak in a moment if you could share on what you found from chapter 12 here in these verses. How does it speak to you? What's a healthy, good, sound interpretation? And then what's a not so sound interpretation of Genesis 12? So we'll start by asking Tilak in a moment to share, and then we might ask Sudesh, Suman, and maybe one or so others to also share as well. Let me turn the recorder back on.